Hi, Misha here, and this is part 2, looking at the stealth fighters of Lockheed-Martin. And the first one, of course, we looked at the F-117A Nighthawk, which was the first military jet designed specifically with stealth in mind. And it was started under Operation Senior Trend, and resulted in a total of 64 aircraft labeled as fighters, but actually were more like bombers, being used. Very secretive skunkworks stuff, and officially retired in 2008 after serving for 25 years. Well, now we get to my favorite plane and yours. Maybe. The F-22A Raptor. And in part 3, we will get to the Lightning and all of its variations. But for now, the Raptor. And these are all 1/72 scale diecast models from Hobby Master. And much like with the 117, the F-22 was really in the first batch I ever ordered. I mean, these are just one I always wanted to have, and the model does not disappoint. Well, let's dig into it. This dates all the way back to 1981. After the success of Senior Trend, a project codenamed Senior Sky was kind of sketched out, thought up, to make a stealth air-superiority fighter to eventually replace the F-15 and some F-16s. Keep in mind the F-16 is a multi-role, so some of them are used for ground attack, but the ones used for air defense. The project was organized and goals were set up in 1983. This was a result in the name Advanced Tactical Fighter, ATF. And then in September of 1985, they would release a request for proposals for designs. And they had several requirements, but there were two that just really jumped out over the others. 1, stealth, of course. 2, super cruise, meaning able to go supersonic without the use of afterburner, which is actually key for stealth, as we kind of talked about with the 117. Well, 7 companies responded, and then on Halloween of 1986, Lockheed-Martin and Northrop were kind of the down select, and each were requested to develop and build and fly 2 prototypes. And 50 months, so just over 4 years, were given for the design and development phase. The Lockheed would be known as the YF-22, and the Northrop would be the YF-23. And since this was such a major project, each company partnered with others. For example, Northrop partnered with McDonnell Douglas because it went oh so well with the F-18 Hornet, right? Anyway, and Lockheed would partner primarily with Boeing, but also General Dynamics would be involved too. So we had big teams going on, yada yada yada. Keeping Super Cruise and stealth at the forefront, the plane was changed and revised and updated several times, and other requirements had to be loosened or changed. For example, originally the max allowed weight was 50,000 pounds. Well, this had to be up to 60,000 if it was to do its job according to what the Air Force wanted. And this was all in response to, at the time, new Soviet technology that was coming around in the 80s. Yes, the MiG-29 was part of it, also the Issue-27, but also new missiles, new technology for SAM batteries and aiming and radars and all that, hence the stealth. It was also decided to give this plane a very secondary but still existent role as an air-to-surface, air-to-ground attack fighter. But this was, again, secondary. Air combat was its preeminent thing. Well, fast forward to 1990, and the prototypes are both ready. The Northrop is called the Black Widow, and, well, the name for the YF-22 kind of changed a lot. Several names were tried. Superstar and Raptor were briefly thought of, and then the name Lightning II really looked like it was going to be the pick, but pretty late the name was given Raptor, which, as we know, eventually stuck permanently and became official. Well, both prototypes flew that year, and the Air Force would evaluate. The 22 proved to be the cheaper of the two, believe it or not, even though this is a vastly expensive aircraft, and the more maneuverable. And the 23 proved to be the stealthier and the overall faster, quicker. In April of 1991, the Secretary of Defense announced the decision to go with the Lockheed-Martin. And interestingly, they ordered that the YF-23 prototypes be dismantled, so the technology, since it was all classified, would not get out. So, with that in mind, work began on making pre-production models, which they would revise the design between the YF-22 and the first pre-production F-22. For example, they would move the cockpit forward, they would change the leading edges for the wings, they would change the rear stabilizers. You get the idea, just tweaking the design for performance and stealth, and of course introducing new technologies, since tech was at the forefront of this plane. As you can tell by its somewhat actual plane shape versus the F-117, the computer modeling technology of the 80s and 90s was greatly improved thanks to faster processing, better software, more memory, so they were able to get away from the whole facet system a great deal. Work began on the first production plane in 1995, and it was first rolled out in early 1997, and then took its first test flight in September of 1997. The first two pre-production planes were not combat capable or anything close to it. They were just, flight tests. The third pre-production model was built to kind of test the weapons structure, the base structure, and ordnance carrying and all of that. And then after that, 6 more pre-production, so a total of 9 were built. And the last couple in the series were essentially fully ready to go, or could be made ready to go extremely easily. So, by September of 2000, a production contract for full scale was awarded, and we would progress from there. It's interesting to note that in total, 1,000 companies were employed to build the technology for this plane. Lockheed-Martin would do final assembly, build many of the components. Boeing would also do quite a large chunk. They would do the wings and the rear fuselage, as well as some of the avionics. And General Dynamics would work with the engines. But then many, many other companies would do other components. So much so that it said nearly 100,000 jobs were involved in this, and that spanned over 46 states, which makes me wonder, which were the 4 states that got left out? You think they could have at least thrown them a bone and let them make something, even if it was just signs, so we could say all 50 states. I'm not even kidding, that just seems weird. It's also interesting, after the whole picking the Raptor name, the name of the plane itself kind of was flippy-floppy. First, it was going to be F-22, and then, because of the changing post-Cold War era it found itself in, the Air Force was deciding to name it FA-22, kind of like the FA-18, to emphasize its secondary role as an attack fighter. They kind of played around with this notion around 2000, 2002, and this stuck for a bit, but then was reversed at the last minute in 2005 when it reverted to the F-22 Raptor. Excuse me, F-22A, even though there was never a B in production. Raptor. This was the first fully functional 5th generation fighter built to have air superiority over 4th generation fighters, including the F-15, MiG-29, and newer versions of Sukhois, as well as Chinese opponents, which are often Russian variations. But during this whole time, there was a huge point of contention over just how many the Air Force wanted, needed, and was going to get. Well, back in 1985, initially the Air Force projected it would purchase ultimately 750 of the ATF, whichever model would be adopted, with full rate production to begin in 1994. Well, in 1990, as the prototypes were flying, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney reviewed the program and reduced this to 648. Okay, so, about 100 less, but realistic enough. Then, of course, the Cold War was over, and by 1994, this had been further reduced after really looking at spending to 442 planned. And by the time of the first prototype, or pre-production, I should say, flight in 1997, the number was down to 339. They like picking these weird numbers. And then it was further reduced to 277 in the early 21st century. The Cold War was over. This was an air superiority fighter. Yeah, the need was just kind of unsure at that time. And then 2004, it was further reduced again to 183 total production models. And then kind of the only upswing was in 2008. Congress voted in a defense spending to increase by 4 for a total production of 195, including the 9 pre-production prototypes. Essentially, it ended up having 186 to 187 combat-capable versions on the docket. Interestingly, $149 would be full combat capable, with 37 listed as trainers. And the first full production model was delivered to the Air Force for testing in January of 2003. and they would build about 2 a month. And the first squadron was declared initially operational in December of 2005. So pretty much 20 years after all this kicked off and got going. So what exactly, after all this time and money, did the Air Force end up with? The F-22 is not a small plane. It's 62 feet long with a wingspan of 44.5 feet. Of course, it's designed with stealth as its primary goal, so there are the curves and angles, and it has a stealth coating. Efforts were taken to minimize anything coming out of the cockpit as well. We have 2 engines whose heat source has also been minimized. The horizontals are an all-moving plane, which they can on this model. Pretty neat. Unlike the 117, the F-22 has a radar, a very effective one actually, capable of detecting enemy aircraft out to at least 150 miles and larger objects past that. It's quite a feat of engineering to have a stealth aircraft with an active radar. Of course, much was done in other ways to minimize radio signals and infrared and even visible identification when possible. It does have a cannon internally. It is an M61A2 Vulcan. Able to carry 480 rounds, 20 millimeter. Very respectable for air-to-air combat. Lessons learned from Vietnam there, for sure. Its primary weapons. It has internal bays. It has a large center bay, and it has 2 small side bays. And that I would show you here. Here are the doors you can plug in for the large center bay. Opens up. The side bays here carry short-range AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, 1 each. Just the 2 doors open up and they go out. That's pretty much what they carry. There's not really an option for those side bays. So that was mostly for defense and just, air-to-air combat. The center bay, though, we have a few options. Initially and originally, the ordinance was to be a total of 6 AIM-120 medium-range missiles and 2 clusters of 3, 1 on each side. Of course, these just plug right in. But as I've said, this had a secondary attack role, and so there is an air-to-surface loadout as an option. Here we retain 1 AIM-120, and then we have 1 1,000-pound JDAM bomb, air-to-surface. It carries 2 of those, meaning a total of 2,000 pounds of bombs, plus still a total of 4 air-to-air missiles. As you can see, the model comes with either one, so you can do air-to-air or air-to-ground. Additionally, the wings can have pylons mounted, up to 2 on each wing. That can be for external standard fuel tanks. 2 of the hard points are plumbed for these. And or missiles. That's what this model comes with here. Bombs, what have you. Of course, if you hang ordnance off the wings, you are greatly sacrificing stealth. But one neat thing, after you expend the fuel from the tanks or fire your weapons, you can eject the remaining pylons, thus restoring the majority of your stealth. Maximum speed with afterburner is over Mach 2. It can tip-top out at 2.25. Super Cruise, during initial testing of the F-22, they got up to nearly 1.6 Mach. And with the full production model, they were able to go over 1.8 Mach unloaded. But with combat loading, it's capable of 1.5 Mach on Super Cruise, so not burning with the afterburner, which not only is better for fuel, but also better for stealth. Altitude is damn impressive. Officially, at least early on, the Air Force acknowledged 50,000 feet plus, but it's been shown over the years that this can operate at 60,000 to 65,000 feet. But what's more impressive, this can actually maneuver at that high of an altitude, whereas most other aircraft cannot. The way the F-22 Raptor, kind of like its namesake in a way, likes to do, it goes high, uses its very long-range radar, and looks down and attacks from above. It prefers to operate high and fast and swoop in and do the deed. It can also drop ordnance onto the ground with very good accuracy from a high altitude. As I said, this was declared initially operational in December of 2005, and then in 2006, 12 of these competed in war games in Alaska, where they performed very well and simulated dogfights. It was air-to-air combat. 2007, it continued to see use. They had practice escort missions, where the F-22 was assigned as a fighter to protect bombers or other valuable targets, and they again performed very well. Also that year, they took their first trip overseas when they went to Japan. And then finally in December of 2007, they were declared fully combat capable, fully operational. The stealth on this plane is of course extremely impressive, especially against the radars and other aircraft, but also those used by SAM sites. About a decade ago, we don't even know today exactly what the cross-section is, but Lockheed said that it's as small as a marble at certain angles. And most fighters like this, most stealth aircraft are designed to be minimal at the front, coming in. Of course, when it opens its weapons bays, it becomes more visible, but the bays and the systems are designed such that this only takes a split second to get the ordnance out. They held off sending this to the Middle East until 2009. They had some reservations, but these were sent to an airbase in the UAE. But also in 2009, around April, many in the government were calling for the cancellation of the F-22 program. As you remember, last year, They'd up the total on order to 187 full production, and by 2009 they were calling for the end of the program to make that it. The president was on board, therefore in July Congress voted to end F-22. Of course, the existing order would be fulfilled. Already by 2010, though, the Air Force was preparing to mothball the production line, put the tooling and all that in technology into storage, and also kind of running feasibilities on starting it up again if it was ever needed. The last Raptor came off the assembly line at Lockheed-Martin in December of 2011 and was delivered to the U.S. Air Force on May 2nd, 2012. At that point, that was it. Total built, 195. With that said, really the story was just beginning in a lot of ways. The aircraft was continually being updated over the years. Even before full production was underway, there was a major software update in 2001. It was updated to use modern munitions like JDAMs in 2005. 2007, it received a radar update improvement. Probably most importantly, in 2011, the fleet was given expanded ground attack capabilities and compatibility, as that was proving to be really where it was needed. Because one reason they decided to cancel the program was Russian and Chinese fighter technology had kind of stalled out at that time. At least that was the perception. And so having an advanced 5th generation fighter just didn't really seem to be what was needed in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This wasn't really doing anything. On top of that, the project was behind schedule and was way over budget. Maybe not as much as the 35 would be later, but still way over budget. So yeah, they just the need. Also in 2012, the oxygen system was updated. I'll just point this out because there were problems with hypoxia with the pilots. The flight suits were really partially to blame, and a lot of it had to do with just the altitude and performance that this was operating at. In 2014, they saw their first combat debut in September when F-22s were used to bomb targets in Syria. And then the next year, in August, these were flown over to Germany for testing with allies, war games again. And then a month after that, Raptors were sent to Poland and Estonia for continued war games with new NATO allies, which Putin just loved to death. These are also stationed near the border of Iran back in 2012 and intercepted Iranian fighter jets beginning in March of 2013. Just kind of letting them know they're there. They've also been used to intercept Russian Tupolev bombers over Alaska and nearby. In 2017, F-22s were used to escort B-52s, talk about the old and the new, to attack opium fields controlled by the Taliban in Afghanistan, also opium warehouses, processing facilities, basically a bunch of opium stuff. So, war on drugs? Sure, why not? And they've continued to be used for armed reconnaissance, patrol, deterrence, since that time. Currently, the Air Force has 186 of these on the books. And an interesting thing happened. Back in 2016, Congress requested the Air Force draw up a paper speculating about starting up that production line again. And so people got excited that maybe the Raptors would come back. They'd start making more. But in June of 2017, the Air Force delivered their assessment that this was not a good idea. They said that the F-22 would not meet their needs and would be extremely expensive to start back up because of the technology. And so, yeah. When they originally canceled the program in 2009, they diverted a lot of the funding to the F-35 as well as the F-18 Super Hornet. And so the Air Force pretty much said we need to keep on that path, not go back to the 22. So it looks like that's it. No more will ever be made. Another thing that really hurt this plane, the government did not allow Lockheed to sell these to any foreign allies. Australia, Japan, Israel, and many others were interested, but because the technology was so cutting edge back in the day, they wouldn't let it. And Congress upheld this decision back in 2006. So with the Air Force the only customer, and then its orders continually cut and then ended, that was pretty much it for the Raptor. Its planned service is still to continue. It's not planned to be retired until at least 2030. Next year, they're planning a new radio communications suite for this. There's also a midlife upgrade scheduled for 2024 to give it more modern sensors, computers, software updates. There was a major software update again this year, 2019, by the way. So yeah, these are still flying. Here's the problem. Unfortunately, this kind of falls in a bad gap. I mean, this is 1980s, at best 1990s technology. It was the first fifth generation, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the best. It fell in that awkward computer gap where processing was getting better and better, but communications and interfaces still were not up to scruff like they are today. Yes, up to scruff, I said that. Not scratch, scruff. I'm going that way. Next, I'll say nerf herder. And that's been really the F-22's failing. Its communications are subpar, especially with friendly aircraft. It cannot transfer data and coordinate with newer planes or even older planes that were successfully upgraded. Also, its stealth tech, while cutting edge at the time, is actually pretty hard to maintain. For example, the coating on the skin requires quite a bit of man work to keep clean and functional. Since it was primarily an air-to-air fighter, I mean, who's it going to go up against? The one reason they looked at starting the program again was, yes, Russian planes are catching up. I did a video on the Su-57, but that itself has experienced delays, and who knows if and when that'll ever go into real production. Not to say China is shabby, they have some very good fighters too, but yeah. Its air-to-ground capabilities exist, but are not outstanding. It can deliver about 2,000 pounds of bombs, at least using the internal bays. It can deliver 5,000 pounds using the external hardpoints, but then you're sacrificing stealth, and at that point, what's kind of the point, you know? Is an F-15E Strike Eagle much worse? They're just expensive to fly and maintain, and with such a small fleet, there's always worry about parts and breakages and replacements and training. Also, a lot of the cockpit gear, the avionics, the displays are aging. it's a shame. If it had been made earlier and went into service earlier, it would have really rocked the world. And if it had been made a little bit later, it could have been built with a lot of the newer tech that came online at the late 90s, early 2000s. But it just wasn't. Still doesn't put any shade on its performance. It's still a high performing. I mean, the speed, the altitude, the stealth. It's still one of the stealthiest planes in the whole wide world. And its air-to-air capabilities really are still unparalleled. But the problem is, less than 200 is not really enough for the Air Force. But the cost of more is too high, so it's just kind of caught in the middle, unfortunately. But I remember this plane was the cutting-edge tech when I was a teenager in the 90s, and I'm actually surprised that it went into production and service. I'm happily so, but yeah, a lot of planes of its ilk were kind of tossed into the dustbin of history. But there you have it, guys. As for the Hobby Master model, like I said, it's neat as hell. It's all metal. It has the moving stabilizers in the back. Let me see if I think these are metal. They are, yeah. The tail's all metal. Of course, the bottom where the bays are, that's plastic, polymer. Comes with a pilot, canopy open, closed. And you can either, display it air-to-air or air-to-surface, which is always neat to have options. You can even put big old fuel tanks on it if you like, but I like having mine clean. In fact, I've never even tried plugging them into the wings. In fact, before the video, I cut open the plastic. I just kept all of them in the plastic. Figured, why not? But yeah, the F-22A Raptor, the U.S. Air Force's aging dinosaur. But it'll still be around for a good 10 plus years for sure. But it was designed for an era, the 1980s, Cold War, and a war that never really came. It's just such a complicated machine. And really, it directly led to the F-35, which was hoped to be cheaper and more flexible. But, yeah, that's its own little story, too, for next time. And with that, I will bid you adieu. And I'll catch you very soon.